as I had shared with you, earlier, I don't think that, the mining sector necessarily attracted me. I stumbled into mining, right? So, of course, I studied environmental science, natural resource management with silviculture as my major, but I ended up in mining. I did not intentionally go to college to decide that I would be in the mining industry. I think this story is not, new to me, but many other people as well who have come into mining. So that's how I got into mining. I think that, if we're talking about next gen, we have to be talking to the next gen, right? We have to talk to the next generation of miners, people who may be at the entry level, people who may still be in school at the university level, or maybe people who have not even decided yet what they're going to study in college. It's important to have that conversation and understand, some of the trends and, what really is exciting to people, the future workforce, not today only, but also into the future. I think the other thing we can do is to talk to the women that we have in our business. And to understand what is keeping them, in our industry or within our business, and for those who are not staying, what is causing them to leave, so that we can begin to leverage, what is keeping the women we currently have in our business, and try to address some of the challenges for others deciding to leave our industry. Recently, our COO, Rob Atkinson, and his operational and projects leadership team have been spending time with many women in our business. So, really reaching out deeper into the business, and not just that their direct reports, but talking to women who, maybe 5 levels deeper in the business, and trying to understand, what are the challenges you face? What do you like most about, your role? And we want to leverage that information to try and make, not just Numa, but our industry more inclusive, and make sure that, all people can thrive in our business, and not just one group of people. When I look at other industries that, have made progress, one of the things that I see as a trend is that you cannot make progress if you do not focus on making progress, right? You have to make a strong commitment that I want to attract more women. I want to attract a diverse workforce. I want to retain more women, and I want to retain a diverse workforce. Side by side with, I want to create a culture that, any woman who comes into your business will decide that, I belong here and this is a place for me. So, it may not sound like a big, bold thing to do, but, they are foundational pieces of work that if we do not focus on, then it's really difficult to attract a diverse workforce. We have to focus on it, and work at it. One of the things I've said is that, the mining industry can figure this out. We have a lot of people who are problem solvers. We have a lot of engineers, who build things, and, they know how to innovate, and, just find the root causes of many challenges. And so if we decide that we want to focus on it, and we decide that we want to see progress, I think that we will see the progress that we all seek to find. I have shared this story, of um, a book that I bought at one of the book fairs that happened at my kids' school. So I have a daughter and a son. My daughter is 9, and my son is 6. And this was maybe about 3 years ago. And my son was really into Paw Patrol. And so we bought this book, and it was about, gold mining. And, we opened the book. And as somebody who is in the industry, I read the story and I said, you know, I don't think that's how we mine at Newmont, right? The story was very medieval, kind of, mining and, the traditional ways of mining. So I think I'm sharing that story to emphasize that, we have to own our own story, and we have to be able to help people to understand, how our operations work, and the conversations that are happening in our businesses, the different career pathways, to your point, different things that people can actually do to progress their careers in the mining industry. So we have to own our own story is the first thing that I would say. I think the second one is that we have to look inward and think about, when if you had a daughter or you had a niece who walked into your operation, at a mine site or wherever we have our mines. Um, what would they see and how would they feel when they get to that location? Would they feel like, oh, this is a place I want to work. This is amazing. This is exactly where I need to be. These people are ready for me. They are people like me. I'm not the only one at the table. People are excited to see me. Nobody's thinking that I got hired because I'm a woman and that's the only reason why I got hired. Is the norm for me to be here? Is that the experience they're going to have, or are they going to have the opposite experience? Right. So, we have to look inward and think about the culture that we're creating and whether that culture and even the basic symbols around us, example, will we have PPE that is, appropriate for the individual? Would there be a washroom that they could use, or would people go like, oh, we didn't create a washroom for you here. What are the things that, that individual what are the experiences they would have if they landed at our mine site? And if that experience is not what we need it to be, we just have to work at it and try to do something different. At Newmont, how we're approaching this is by eliminating basic symbols of exclusion. I'm talking basic like amenities, like do you have washrooms at different locations where people, can use those washrooms? Are you providing PPE, that actually fits, the person who is collecting that PPE? It's just really looking inward and beginning to eliminate those symbols of exclusion whilst creating, inclusive experiences for everybody. It starts off with some of the things that I talked about, right? Why should they choose you as a company or as an industry, right? Why should they choose to come work for the mining industry? We have to be able to reflect on whether we have created the environment and we have created the systems and we have the right symbols, before really saying we need you to come and work for us and we want to attract this talent pool. We have to do our homework and really understand that we have the culture that enables. And the reason why we have to do that is if you do not, what happens is that you have a revolving door, and there's a lot of data to show that you would attract the talent, but then they will not stay, right? So you would not be able to retain that talent. And so that piece of work is really important, really understanding, ensuring that the culture that we have at our mine sites, in our offices, in our businesses, is a culture that tells women, the women we're trying to attract, that this is a great place for them to work. I think the other piece is really, moving beyond just behavior change into places where we're doing true systemic change, right? So Newmont did some work around testing the impact of blind resumes. We tested the impact of the language we use in our job postings. We also tested the impact of having a diverse slate and a diverse interview panel. And all these studies showed that, they make a difference, right? And some of them even make a difference across cultures. And so we have to begin to think about, the people systems, the recruitment systems that we're using, and try to disrupt any bias that is in that system as well. So changing behaviors, managing some of those, eliminating those symbols of exclusion, but also really looking at our systems, and trying to develop processes that disrupt any bias in those systems. And I think the last one is really, if you're joining a company, I don't think there's anybody who joins the company without talking to somebody they know. If they know somebody in that company, they're definitely going to talk to that person and ask them, how is that company? Do you think it's a great place? Would you recommend that I come over? And so we have to focus on the women that are in our business as well. Because if somebody reaches out to them and they're like, well, I'm thinking about leaving this place, or, this is not the place that you want to come, then there's nothing that we can say because they trust, their networks. And so it's important that we also focus on the women that are within our business and ensure that they have the right environment and culture to thrive, and they're seeing progress in their careers as well, so they can also become the ambassadors that we need. I
Course.
think the other piece is like having the mentality that, there's no silver bullet. There's no one thing that as soon as we do that, we will be able to attract,
No.
more women into the mining industry, and kind of positioning ourselves like the true problem solvers that we are as an industry, right? So, we identify root causes, we think about why women are staying, why they're not staying, and then we prioritize, these root causes and try to come up with interventions that address these. We test it, we make sure that it's working. If it's not working, we do something different, and understand that it's not just one thing that we do, that would change everything. Because, sometimes you hear people say, let's just hire more women from the universities. But if those women come into our business and the women who are already in our business are saying, I don't even know why you're here, that, is counterproductive to what we're trying to do. So really thinking holistically and leveraging different opportunities to try different things and see what works. I think you don't you start off by not forgetting that you went all the way out to try and bring them into your business, right? You put out different types of stories, your ads, your inclusive job postings, and now you've brought them into your business. And again, I may be saying this over and over again, but if you've not done the work on your culture, when they get into your business, they're going to realize that you've not done the work on your culture. So that's the reason why I kind of talk about that a lot. You have to make sure that, what you're selling is what the experience is when the talent gets into your business. And so that is the first thing. I think the second thing is ensuring that you have community. So at Numa, we have our business resource groups. We have about 26 of those business resource groups globally that focus on a variety of topics. We have women and allies, we have our veterans and our allies, we have our pride BRGs and allies, multicultural type BRGs, we have indigenous people, local employees, BRGs. And I think, ensuring that you're cultivating a sense of belonging where people feel like, oh, I'm not the only, there are people here that, can support me, or that, I might be the only, but, there are many allies that are already reaching out to me to make sure that I'm successful in this role. And so really creating that sense of belonging and that inclusive workplace. So at Newmont, inclusion is one of our 5 core values. And so enabling that inclusive workplace so people can find that community and they can find that sense of belonging is key. I think the other thing is that when we are having conversations about talent, we have to challenge ourselves for of our biases, right? We have like me bias when, people remind you of yourself. And usually the people who remind you of yourself look like you and have a lot of things in common with you, which means that, it's difficult for, somebody to say that this woman, for, a man to say that this woman reminds me of myself. Just, bias place out there. And so we have to challenge ourselves and make sure that, even after we've had the conversation, we are asking ourselves if, there's anybody we are overlooking. Is there somebody we did not consider? Or even when we've made a decision, asking ourselves, am I choosing this person for this role because they are more like me? Or is it because they're going to challenge my thoughts and challenge my assumptions and they are very different from me? So we have to challenge ourselves when we make, talent decisions. And I think, with everything that has happened from last year, organizations need to take this seriously and realize that our employees expect us to do more. Our investors expect us to do more. Communities and governments expect us to do more. So we really do not have a choice in deciding, what, we will do a little bit of diversity, we will do a little bit of inclusion. This is going to be, if not already, a very critical topic. And it's going to be the reason why some people choose to join your business, that you're working at creating a more inclusive workplace, or you're working at creating a more diverse workforce. So these are some of the things. And again, I'll end by saying, like, we have to understand that there's many things that we have to do and commit our funding, commit our time, and all other resources to try and make a difference. I think it is some of the things that I've talked about, like, the consequences of the similarity bias, right? So, and it's natural. I'm not blaming a specific group to say, it's your fault and you're being intentional in choosing people who are more like you. If we have a brain, we have bias. And so it's the consequence of that. And what I mean by that is that, the people who get the sponsorships, right? So there's mentorship, there's coaching, but then sponsorship is somebody leveraging their social capital, within the business to promote somebody else, or they are lending that capital for someone else who under normal circumstances may not have that, right? So an example would be, you have a senior leader who is advocating for somebody who is not in the room, who is very different from that senior leader. And the research shows that, that is one of the things that enables career progress, because as we all know, a lot of the informal conversations, are not happening in the room, right? They're happening when people are having some of those, chit chats, or, just simple conversations outside of the workplace. And so I think that is one of the challenges, having enough sponsorship, people who are willing to go above and beyond to advocate for women when they're not in the room, and to say, look, I think we should give this person a chance, and give them the right support and make sure that they are successful. Um, I think the other challenge is, I think the pandemic has brought forth, the fact that we can do some of our work in a flexible way, right? Not everything has to happen at a mine site. I think the mining industry has risen to that occasion. And, many companies have thought about what work really needs to be done at a mine site. And so, that used to be a big challenge. I'm sure it still is for a few, for some of the companies in our industry. But I think the pandemic has showed us that, when we're all pushed to the wall, we will come up with innovative ways of getting work done, outside of the mine site. So I think that we're making progress there. So sponsorship, providing more flexibility and really rethinking where work gets done, I think is key. And I think the last one is like, um, being open to doing things differently, right? So maybe a certain role has always been this way, um, but maybe we could think about why has it always been that way, and could we change that? Could we do something different when it comes to that role? Because if we look at our industry, it has been male dominated, since its inception, which means that, if you're looking for only experience that somebody has done something before, you're only going to find, a certain group of people who have done that, because historically, it hasn't included as many women. And so if you only think about you have to have this experience in order to go into this role or in order to be successful, that becomes a challenge. But if we challenge ourselves to think about, you know, for a specific role, what is really needed in that role? And, can somebody from the oil and gas industry, or, can somebody, from a different industry possess that? And if not, what can we do to bridge that gap? So I think these are some of the challenges that, women face, especially in progressing, to the top or to those P&L type roles. I think one of the main things is just remaining open, and I've shared, a lot of people who know me know that I have transitioned careers, from environment into safety, into talent management, HR, and I think, being open to the possibilities, right? Sometimes it feels comfortable to be the expert, at doing something, and then, you switch into something where you're not the expert and you have to relearn things, in order to, get better at it. And so I think that is one of the things that really helped me, that I was, open to doing different things very early on in my career. And I continue to use a lot of the things that I have learned, transitioning different types of roles. Even here at Newmont, I joke that, this is probably like my seventh role at Newmont, or eighth role, and I've been with Newmont for 10 years, which, means that I've done so many different things, even in, within the HR space. So that definitely has helped me a lot. I think the other thing is sponsorship, and the reason why I really believe in sponsorship, because sometimes you would have a sponsor that you do not even know is your sponsor, right? And again, it goes back to that bias. Somebody sees you and they're like, I think you can be great. And then they advocate for you so strongly when you're not in the room, and you only experience the results of their advocacy on your behalf. So those two, I would say, have been really helpful for me. I think that the last one is that, um, I have had to learn, to be comfortable and okay with not knowing it all and not being the expert in the room. And that is the advice that I give people who are considering transitioning from one aspect of whether different industry to another industry, or even from a different function, to another function, or even within functions, and, moving across, function, within that function. I think being okay with not being the expert, and, being able to learn fast in that process, and asking for help where you need it, is really helpful. And those are some of the things that have really, helped me as I've, progressed my own career. So, usually when people ask me the questions about quotas, I start off by correcting that, or maybe trying to, differentiate between a quota and a target, right? So at Numa, we do have targets, just like any other metric, around finance, production, safety, anything that we do have targets. And the difference between a target and a quota is that a target is based on data, right? So you're looking either at your trend, And then you're using that to forecast and decide that this is where, I need to be by a certain time. And then maybe you can add an outstanding component to it and say, well, if we continue to do a great job like we've been doing, this is where we should be in 5 years or in 2 years. However, if we want to challenge ourselves, maybe we're going to add a 20% multiplier or a 10% multiplier or whatever that may be. And so for us at Newmont, we don't have quotas. We do have targets, and the process that we go through is exactly what I just explained. We look at our past performance and we look at our best performance over the years, and then we use that to forecast where we should be. And then we have a conversation with our leadership and decide, here we want to be outstanding. We want to accelerate here, or we want to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And so we would add a multiplier to it. I think, that makes it easier for everyone to understand, and understand that, this is something that is similar to any other targets that we may have in our business. So I think what gets, I don't remember who said this, but what gets measured gets done, or what gets measured gets attention, and what gets measured, gets discussed. And so, having targets, the data shows that it works. And I believe it works. It doesn't mean that it works easily, right? There's a lot of work that needs to be done around those targets from a change management perspective, to even help people to understand why you're setting the targets, how you're setting the targets, and what their accountabilities are around those targets. So I personally believe in targets. I do not believe in quotas that are arbitrary, maybe because of the science part of my brain, but I believe in data informed targets. That is such a good question. I think, when I look back on my career, I was a very serious person, wanted everything to be perfect. And, I wish that earlier in my career, I knew that, it's okay to go at a pace, right? It's okay to, hold yourself, to a higher standard, but also to put yourself first, and to make sure that you're voicing out what you need, and voicing out what your aspirations are and where you need to go. So that is definitely one thing that, I wish that, I knew. I think the other thing is, about negotiation. I know that when I have a conversation about negotiation, especially with women, it's very different from the conversation that I have with men. Whereas, a lot of the men would say, yeah, you should absolutely negotiate. Many of the women, I'm overgeneralizing here, but would say, well, I think it's fair. What they're providing is fair. And I have had to learn, over my career, how to negotiate and how to really, ask for what you need and ask for what you want, especially, from a negotiation perspective. So I definitely did not have those skills earlier in my career. And now, I make it a point to make sure I'm coaching every other woman that I meet about negotiations.